Good afternoon and welcome members of HEROG. We're here today because we all share a common interest. An interest in organs, organ music and organists. Some time ago when I became the president of the York and District Organist Association, I was asked the question, why are you interested in organs and when did that interest start? I guess most of you will have been asked a similar question. Well, personally, I can trace my interest back to one particular day on one particular event. In September 1972, I started secondary school, and my school was then joined on to the town hall. The school is no longer there, but the town hall is. And I remember being led through into the hall 2 by 2 down the left hand side of the stage, and as I passed the stage I could hear and feel the sound of a pipe organ. I then turned to the person next to me and said, I didn't know there was an organ in the town hall. Well, the strange thing about that question is, and I keep asking myself is, how did I know what an organ was to be able to ask that question? To me, you found organs in churches, and as far as I remember, I'd only ever been into a church twice up to that point, when I was younger, at family weddings. So how did I know about organs? What was it at some point earlier that had captured my interest to the extent that I would make that comment? Hence the purpose of this talk, to try and find out where I may well have encountered organs prior to that point in some other context.
The simplest form of organ can be traced back thousands of years. To us it's known as the pan flute, often known as panpipes, or the syrinx. It's a musical instrument based on the principle of the closed tube, consisting of multiple pipes of gradually increasing length and sometimes girth. Multiple varieties of pan flutes have been popular as folk instruments, and very much so in South America, and they still are today. Pipes are typically made from bamboo, giant cane or local reeds. Other materials include wood, plastic, metal and ivory. They will be typically used to play folk music of the time or for dance music of the time. And again today they're very, very popular, and you often will hear them in television music with their soft, soothing tones. They are simply played by blowing across the end of the tube. By blowing harder, you can actually raise the note the octave. The earliest known mechanical pipe organ was called the hydraulis. It was invented in around the 3rd century BC in Alexandria, culminating in prior attempts to apply a mechanical wind supply to a large set of panpipes. Its pipes stood on top of a wind chest that was connected to a conical wind reservoir. The reservoir was supplied by air by 1 or 2 pumps. Air under hydraulic pressure activated the pipes as controlled by an elementary keyboard. The hydraulis would have been used to accompany local folk music and dancing. Unlike panpipes, the hydraulis could play and hold more than one note at once, so we start to hear chords and harmony in the music. It was starting to become more and more complex and starting to sound more like the organ that we're accustomed to hearing today. Towards the middle of the 13th century, miniatures of illuminated manuscripts depict what are called portative organs, which have modern balanced action keyboards. These were very popular for secular music. They had one rank of flute pipes producing a flute-like sound, sometimes arranged in rows to save space, and was slung from the player's neck by a strap. The keys and pipes lay at right angles to the player, who used 2 fingers of his right hand to play the melodies. The left hand was used to pump the bellows, which provided the air. These were truly portable instruments of the time, and again used for accompanying popular music and dance. Another form of portative organ was what was known as the regal. The difference being that instead of having flue pipes, the regal had reed pipes, and it had a very characteristic reedy sound to it. As we start to move through the period of the Renaissance, music starts to become more and more complex. The organ starts to develop accordingly, and it itself becomes more complex, meeting the different needs, the different contexts that it finds itself in. The positive organ is a next step up from the portative organ. First of all, you would notice that there are more keys. This enabled the player actually to play with both hands. The actual pumping of the organ was done by somebody else. More stops, different ranks of pipes, so we then have a combination of tone colours, a combination of pitch. The organ starts to become an essential component in most musical ensembles. The organ had been around for around 1100 years before it started making its way into churches. It would appear that the organ was first used for ceremonial purposes within the church. By the 1400s, the organ was well established in the monastic and cathedral settings. By the early 1500s, the organ was still only capable of playing one sound at a time, effectively one rank of pipe. Eventually, mechanisms were developed so that separate sets of pipes could be played either on their own or in combination, providing much variation in the dynamics and tone colour of the organ. The organ as we know today, with all its stops, its effects, its swell boxes, was probably developed in Germany in the mid-1500s. As churches and cathedrals got bigger, so did the organs, bigger and bigger. A range of large and small organs could be found in churches and cathedrals across Europe. They were used mainly on festival occasions and in alternation with church choirs for liturgical purposes. It wasn't until much later that the organ would start to appear in churches, actually leading worship, leading the singing and accompanying the choirs, similar to what we know today. The organ didn't develop as fast in England as it was in Europe. However, organs were definitely here by the late 1400s and early 1500s. In fact, Henry VIII is known to own dozens of chamber organs and regals. In England, unfortunately, by the mid-1600s, Oliver Cromwell's Puritan movement was responsible for destroying many organs and other works of art in English churches. For the Puritans, the organ and its music represented anything but the piety and religiosity in which we often associate it. As the organ developed in its complexity and tone, so did the music that was written for it. And with the likes of Buxtehude, Bach and all the others you know, there became a wealth of repertoire for the organ as an instrument in its own right. It was Mozart who recognised it truly as the king of instruments. After the Reformation, a period known as the Restoration, organ builders such as Renatus Harris and Father Bernard Smith brought new organ building ideas from continental Europe. English organs evolved from small 1 or 2 manual instruments into 3 or more divisions disposed in the French manner, with grander reeds and mixtures, though still without pedal boards. It was 1851, in the Great Exhibition, that organ builders from across Europe exhibited various organs, and it was then that the mechanism of the organ started to develop to make it bigger and more easier to play. The development of pneumatic action was a particular innovation at the time and well developed in this country. Organs, most cathedrals had organs at that point, although not quite as large as what we have today, but most of the parish churches were still without organs. Smaller organs were developed, and by the end of the 19th century, most parish churches, big or small, had an organ of some form or other. Of course, having an organ was one thing, having someone to play it was another, and that led to the development of organs that could play themselves, barrel organs. Many churches didn't have access to an organist, so what they had installed was barrel organs. Again, it was development in mechanisms that allowed this to happen. And basically, a barrel with a series of pins on in the right order that rotated opened up pallets or the valves that let air to the pipes, and so the tune was played. And many small churches had access to barrel organs. The barrel organ, in effect, was an early form of recorded music. Many large country houses also had barrel organs as a means of entertainment. During the prosperity of the Victorian period, the organ became very much the instrument to have, and anybody who had a house or a palace big enough wanted one, and most of them had one. Queen Victoria, herself a very accomplished musician, and her husband Prince Albert, also a keen musician, were determined to have the best organ in her newly constructed ballroom at Buckingham Palace. The original organ actually came from the Royal Pavilion, Brighton, which had been installed at some point beforehand for the Prince Regent. Because the pavilion at Brighton was no longer effectively a royal residence, she wanted the organ removed, and it was installed in the ballroom at Buckingham Palace. The organ was added and developed from there, but it's still a very fine instrument today, as you can hear it played now. Mendelssohn himself actually played that organ and thought it was an excellent instrument. Another fine house organ, this time by the renowned organ builder Henry Willis, can be found in Blenheim Palace, a fantastic 4-manual organ at the end of the Grand Library. Well worth a visit, and members of the public can play the organ, but you must have permission from the Duke of Marlborough. I know because I've tried. This organ does actually have attached to it a roll player, so it can play automatically. A little closer to home, I'm sure you will all be familiar with the organ at Sledmere House. Lovely instrument, the organ situated at the top of the stairs in the dome, and the console just below to the left-hand side of the staircase. As you will be aware, house organs are still very popular and very desirable today, even in the more humbler dwellings, and several of our members of both this association and other associations I'm aware of have very nice pipe organs in their own homes. well established as a musical instrument, both musically and mechanically. And indeed, it's an instrument that we would recognise today. The instruments we play today, many are from that period of time totally unaltered, a testimony to the craftsmanship and skills of the organ builders of the time. The musical repertoire had been built up over 300 years with some of the greatest composers known to us. Also established was a whole group of skilled musicians, skilled organists, both in Europe and in this country. At this period in time, recorded music still wasn't widely available. Early developments in the phonograph were underway, but not available to the general public. Music itself was very much for the elite. It was expensive to go to concerts in the great concert halls. It was expensive to hear orchestras. The only place you could hear the organs was in your cathedrals and in church. Organ recitals, as we know them today, weren't established at that point. It's at this point that the organ goes back to its roots, although utilising the modern technology, the technology of the mechanisms, and in particular the technology using a roll of punched paper, similar to that used in what superseded the barrel organ and allowed music to be effectively recorded in what today we would know as a digital format, on paper holes that allowed air to pass through, operating the valves under the pipes and the pipes then sounding. This meant that recorded music could be played. Similar to the origins of the organ, where panpipes, regals, portative organs were played for folk singing and for dancing. There was still a need for that, and the organ developed using this role play technology to what we come to know as the fairground organ and the busker organ. The fairground organ really came into its own in around 1895 with the patenting by the Gavioli Company of the music book. Fairground organs, or band organs, comprise some of the most colourful automatic musical instruments ever made. These instruments, loudly voiced so they could be heard above the surrounding din, provided music for carousels, carnivals, circuses, amusement parks, skating rinks and similar attractions, and they still do to this very, very day. Around the country and across Europe there are many museums for mechanical music, and these organs are preserved, maintained and can be heard live. Hand-cranked portable busker organs are still very popular today, and there's a whole group of amateur organ constructors making these organs, myself being one of them. While traditional punched music is still used, modern technology and the advent of MIDI musical instrument digital interface, the organs are starting to develop and take advantage of modern technology. However, the basic principles are still the same, and music is produced by compressed air going through pipes. The middle of the 19th century was a time of great economic growth and tremendous prosperity. Many of our big cities who benefited from this prosperity decided to show their wealth by building grand Victorian town halls. Initially, these were big concert halls where orchestras would accompany big choral societies and people could go at great expense and listen to live music. It wasn't long before the Victorians realised that the organ in itself was very much a one-man band, an orchestra. So they installed very big organs in their very big town halls. Each city had to have one better than the next, and the organ came into its own as a one-piece orchestra, much cheaper than hiring an orchestra. This led to a growth in transcriptions. Familiar orchestral music was transcribed for the organ. The trend for building large concert halls with symphonic organs continued, not just across Europe but across the world. And our friends in America built the largest concert organ ever built. The Boardwalk Hall Auditorium organ is the pipe organ in the main auditorium of the Boardwalk Hall, formerly known as the Atlantic City Convention Hall in Atlantic City, New Jersey, built by the Midmer-Losh Organ Company. It is the largest organ in the world as measured by the number of pipes, officially 33,112, but the exact number is not known. The main auditorium has a floor area of 140,000 square feet. Consequently, the organ runs on much higher wind pressures than most organs in order to achieve a volume loud enough to fill the hall. The organ has 4 entries in the Guinness World Records, including largest pipe of organ ever constructed, largest musical instrument ever constructed, and the loudest musical instrument ever constructed, and holds several records in the organ world. It's the only one of 2 organs in the world to have an open 64-foot rank, and the only organ to have stops voiced on 100 inches of wind pressure. The end of the 19th century, from 1890 onwards, saw the development of the motion picture and the building of large theatres or cinemas where the films were shown. The early films, of course, were referred to as silent movies. The technology didn't exist at the time to synchronise sound with the actual movie. The term silent film is something of a misnomer, as these films were almost always accompanied by live sounds. During the silent era that existed from the mid-1890s to the late 1920s, a pianist or theatre organist, or even in large cities a small orchestra, would often play music to accompany the films. Pianists and organists would play either from sheet music or improvisation. Sometimes a person would even narrate the intertitle cards for the audience. Though at the time the technology to synchronise sound with the film did not exist, music was seen as an essential part of the viewing experience. As cinemas got bigger, seating up to 3,000 people or even more, the organ was the logical instrument of choice because it was able to fill such a large space with sound. Initially, organs as we know them, ordinary church-type organs, were installed with 1 or 2 modifications. But by 1910, Rudolf Wurlitzer, with the help of Robert Hope Jones, developed what we now know as the cinema organ. With the development of electric action, mainly thanks to the work of Robert Hope Jones, organ consoles could be detached from the pipework a considerable distance, and it was quite common to see in theatres the organ rising from a pit. The use of tremulants on the organs allowed them to be voiced more orchestrally, so you get the lovely effect of shimmering strings and beautiful floating flutes. Additions to the organ included sound effects, train whistles, car horns, drums, castanets and tambourines were all a feature on the cinema organ, designed to accompany those silent movies. By 1927, the first sound films had been produced, the first one being The Jazz Singer. The development of the talkie movie ultimately signalled the end of the cinema organ era. Whilst the popularity of the cinema organ waned in America, it still remained very popular in England and Europe. The organ was often heard before the film, during the interval and after the film, and the BBC World Service often broadcast on a Sunday evening cinema organs from different cinemas around the country. This was very popular and transmitted around the world. The BBC broadcasts became so popular that they commissioned their own theatre organ. The first resident BBC organist to be appointed was Reginald Fort. As part of his contract, he was allowed to take 2 outside engagements a month and found they were always sold out performances. Vaudeville was extremely popular in the years prior to World War II, and Fort got the idea that an organ performance would be a popular addition to the vaudeville bill. Most theatres were not organ equipped, so he surmised it would be necessary to have an instrument which could be taken down after the last show on Saturday night, transported to the next theatre, usually within 100 miles, and set up ready for the first show Monday evening. The Moeller Organ Company of Haggerston in Maryland was willing to build an organ to Fort's specification, with the understanding that he would not complain if he didn't like what he got. Fort's idea was to build an organ on a grand scale, which would be impressive when compared to other theatre organs that may be installed in nearby theatres. The organ arrived in London in 1938 and immediately started touring the vaudeville circuit. Fort resigned from the BBC to tour with the organ. They engaged a staff of 15 and purchased 4 30-foot road trucks to transport the organ. Altogether, the organ weighed 30 tons. It took about 4.5 hours to take the organ down and load it into the trucks. The photos above show the large crew required to set up the organ. The swell shutters were hung from stage rigging in front of the pipes, and during the finale of the programme were raised to show the pipework. One of the biggest problems was the different electric currents in Britain, which required carrying 6 blowing motors. It was amazing how little tuning was required, apart from an occasional slip stopper in a tibia pipe. The flue stop stayed dead in tune, and Moeller had fitted the tuning wire on every reed with a set screw, which prevented the reed from getting bumped out of tune over rough roads. Imagine how much this would cost today. Unfortunately, the timing of this project was not good. The war in Europe cut short the travel of this unique organ, and after a successful 10 months, it came to an abrupt halt when half of the trucks were taken for transport of war materials. Another unfortunate result of the war was the loss of the BBC theatre organ in one of the early bombing raids. Fort offered the BBC the use of the Moeller, and it was installed in an unused Methodist chapel the BBC took for an interim broadcast facility. When the BBC decided the Moeller would no longer fit into their broadcasting scheme, the organ was sold to the Netherlands radio station and installed in a new studio. In the 1970s, the organ was sold on again, and it was shipped back to America, where it ended up in San Diego, in of all places, a pizza restaurant. Several of these pizza restaurants existed around America called Organ Power Pizza. This one is in Pacific Beach, California, just outside San Diego. In 1935, with the invention of the Hammond organ, the organ as we know it was about to undergo its biggest change in its history. The removal of the pipes and the removal of the wind, to be replaced by sound generation of an electronic form. The electronic organ developed from that point onwards, up to the current instruments we have today. The tone generation systems started off in a very basic way and have now become much more complex as electronics has developed. And the most latest development is the use of the Hauptwerk system, which actually uses recorded sounds from real organs, probably the most realistic system yet to producing the sounds of pipe organs. The electronic organ has always been controversial. The forms it takes start no longer to look like an organ as we know, although they have several keyboards, they may have partial pedal boards, they've got different stops and so on. Some of the things that they have, including automatic rhythm systems where you've got a drum player, automatic backing and so on, have made them very, very popular in popular music. And lots of bands you would see, initially a Hammond organ in the 60s, that very distinctive sound penetrating through the band. In many ways, the organ has gone back to its roots, accompanying singing, folk music, dancing. All was not bad news for the organ. With the advent of electronics, organs could become smaller, easy to transport and fit in smaller places like people's homes. So the organ became more widespread. As the tone of the organ became better and more realistic, it was starting to be accepted in churches. It was a cheaper alternative to the pipe organ. One person to take advantage of the portability of the organ was Virgil Fox. Virgil Fox was on a mission to bring organ music, real organ music, to the masses. He travelled all around the United States to all the big concert halls, promoting the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Following in Virgil's footsteps, Carl O'Kelly, a former pupil, travelled the UK with his touring organ, an Allen. The organ progressed from accompanying the movies to actually being in the movies. With its dark, sinister tones, it was very much suited to the genre of the horror movie. The Bach Toccata in D minor is a common track to be found in horror movies. At least in this scene from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they used the hands of a real organist. The War March of the Priests became known as the Abominable Dr. Phibes theme. It wasn't always horror movies that the organ appeared in. It can be seen here in the film Help. The organ plays a starring role in What a Card Up, a precursor to the Carry On movies. The organ can be seen in so many movies and on television, often just in the background, but nevertheless it's there.
Always knew I should have kept up my piano lessons.
The Wanamaker organ is located within a spacious 7-storey grand court at Macy's Centre, formerly Wanamaker's department store, and is played twice a day, Monday through Saturday. The organ is featured at several special concerts held throughout the year, including events featuring the Friends of the Wanamaker Organ Festival, Chorus and Brass Ensemble. The organ was purchased in 1909 by John Wanamaker. It took 2 years to install, and it was first played on June the 22nd, 1911, at the exact moment when the British King George V was crowned. It was also featured later that year when US President William Howard Taft dedicated the store. Despite its then unprecedented size with more than 10,000 pipes, it was judged inadequate to fill the 7-storey Grand Court. The first project to enlarge the organ with the addition of 8,000 pipes was between 1911 and 1917. Many of the large American sports stadiums had organs installed, just like in the cinemas. The organ was there to entertain the crowd before the match, during the interval and after the match, and sometimes it played along during the match as well. The Chicago Stadium was one of the biggest, and the Barton Organ Company was commissioned to build the largest cinema organ or theatre organ ever built. The stadium's no longer there, but the organ was saved and it's now being installed at another venue. It's a massive 6-manual organ with the pipes, tens of thousands of them, installed in the ceiling above the centre of the arena. John D. and Adolph Spreckels donated the Spreckels organ to the city of San Diego in 1914 for the Panama, California exposition. This unique organ contains more than 5,000 pipes, ranging in length from size of a pencil to 32 feet, and is the largest outdoor pipe organ in the world. The Spreckels organ is housed in an ornate vaulted structure with highly embellished gables. Since 1917, San Diego has had a civic organist who performs free weekly Sunday concerts. This is where the well-known Welsh organist Dr. Carol Williams was based. The Great Stalacpipe Organ is an electrically actuated lithophone located in Luray Caverns, Virginia, USA. It's operated by a custom console that produces the tapping of ancient stalactites of varying sizes with solenoid actuated rubber mallets in order to produce the tones. There is another context, of course, which we mustn't forget, and that is the context of the ballroom, one in particular, the world-famous Blackpool Tower Ballroom, with that very famous Wurlitzer organ. There are still a few contexts we haven't explored where we may find organs in their many different forms. Schools. Many schools have organs in their chapels, in their assembly halls. Our universities, just about all our universities, have organs, one form or another. Art galleries, there's the well-known Kelvin Grove Art Gallery in Glasgow, and I'm sure there are others. There may well be shops, hotels, shopping malls, various places where we will find organs. The other place, of course, is all the organ heritage centres, mainly cinema organ centres, but we can still find a whole range of organs which have been extracted from their original buildings and lovingly preserved for future generations to listen to and to play.